Inflation.
Inflation. Asians are feeling the pinch in the face of high inflation and rising cost of living.
This study focused on inflation as a key macroeconomic issue that affects the price of goods, the cost of living, and country economic stability. The study is conducted using a literature review method based on textbook, general article, and official report, supported by data analysis and example of current economic conditions to strengthen understanding of inflation. The objective of this assignment are explain the concept and types of inflation, understand the difference between inflation and GDP, identify the factor that cause inflation, analyze its effect on individual, firm, and the government, and examine Malaysia measure to control inflation based on relevant data and current economic conditions. Based on the book Principle of Economy written by Aniza Mat Ali, inflation is characterized as a rise in general price level. Type of inflation. First, demand pull inflation. This occurs when the aggregate demand in an economy rises sharply while the economy is at or near full employment. Second is cost push inflation. This is triggered by a rise in the average cost of the production. When it becomes more expensive for firms to produce goods, they pass this cost on to consumer through higher price. Third is import inflation. Inflation caused by an increase in the price of imported product or raw material for foreign countries.
In this section, we examine Malaysia's inflation and GDP data from 2015 to 2025 to understand the overall economic trends during this period. These indicators help explain changes in price levels and economic activity over time. This table shows Malaysia's annual inflation rate from 2015 to 2025. The data indicates that inflation fluctuated across the years, with some periods experiencing relatively low and stable inflation, while other years recorded higher inflation rates. These fluctuations reflect changes in consumer price influenced by domestic demand, production costs, and external economic factors. This table presents Malaysia's gross domestic product or GDP over the same period. GDP measures the total value of goods and services produced in the economy and reflect the country's overall economic performance. The data shows periods of economic growth, slowdown, and recovery, highlighting how Malaysia's economy responded to different economic conditions. The inflation curve illustrates the trend of inflation in Malaysia from 2015 to 2025. The curve shows how inflation increased during certain periods and remained relatively stable during others. This inflation curve is derived from the Consumer Price Index or CPI, which will be explained in more detail in the next section. Overall, the curve provides a visual representation of changes in price levels over time.
Next is Consumer Price Index. Consumer Price Index is a weighted average of prices and is representative of aggregate consumer spending, and it is used as a metric for inflation and deflation. Based on Department of Statistics Malaysia, the CPI tracks the cost of 13 main groups of goods and services purchased by Malaysians. Now, let's look at the CPI curve from the year 2015 to 2035. From 2015 to 2017, Malaysia's CPI stayed relatively stable with slow inflation. Between 2018 and 2019, prices increased slightly due to higher living and fuel costs. In 2020, CPI dropped as COVID-19 reduced demand during lockdowns. From 2021 to 2022, CPI rose sharply because of global supply disruptions and rising food and energy prices. Between 2023 and 2025, inflation gradually stabilized as economic conditions improve and price pressures ease. Now, let's look at what is inflation. Inflation refers to the general increase in prices of goods and services over time, which reduces purchasing power. Gross domestic product measures the total value of goods and services produced in a country within a specific period. When GDP increases, consumer spending rises, leading to higher demand and upward pressure on prices. When GDP decreases, spending falls and inflation tends to be lower. From 2015 to 2017, Malaysia's economy grew steadily with moderate increases in GDP and inflation. In 2018 and 2019, growth slowed and prices stayed low, showing a weak demand. The pandemic hit in 2020. GDP fell sharply to negative 5.5% and inflation turned negative at negative 1.1%. Recovery began in 2021 and by 2022, GDP surged to 9% with inflation at 3.4%, reflecting a strong demand. From 2023 to 2025, growth and prices stabilized, showing a balanced and controlled economy.
Now, all of us wondering, what are the factors causing inflation in Malaysia? One of the main factors contributing to inflation in Malaysia is demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation occurs when aggregate demand in the economy increases faster than the supply of goods and services. After the COVID-19 pandemic, Malaysia experienced an economic recovery where consumer spending increased, especially on essential goods such as food, healthcare, and transportation. However, production and supply chains were unable to adjust immediately, which led to upward pressure on prices. Another important factor is cost push inflation, which is caused by rising production costs. In Malaysia, increases in fuel and energy prices raise transportation and operational costs for firms, particularly in the manufacturing and food sectors. Businesses responded to this higher cost by transferring them to consumers in the form of higher prices. In addition, Malaysia experienced imported inflation due to global economic conditions. Global supply chain disruptions and Russia-Ukraine conflict led to increases in international food and energy prices. Since Malaysia depends heavily on imported raw materials and food products, higher global prices directly increase domestic inflation. These inflationary factors resulted in several noticeable effects on the Malaysian economy. One major effect is the rising cost of living. Prices of essential goods such as food, fuel, and housing increase, while wage growth remained relatively slow. As a result, households face greater financial pressure and difficulty maintaining their standard of living. Another significant effect is the reduction in purchasing power. Inflation reduces the real value of income, meaning consumers are able to purchase fewer goods and services with the same amount of money. Changes in household spending behavior, including reduced savings and lower non-essential expenditure, become more apparent during periods of high inflation. Finally, inflation also affects business performance and economic stability. Rising input costs reduce profit margins, particularly for small and medium-sized enterprises. Prolonged inflation creates economic uncertainty, which may discourage investment and slow down economic growth.
Next, we go to 6.0, Malaysia's strategy for managing inflation. First, promoting monetary stability. Bank Negara Malaysia (BNM) implements monetary policy by setting the overnight policy rate, which is OPR. This rate in turn influences how banks set interest rates for loans, financing, and deposits. During periods of strong demand and high inflation, BNM raises the OPR, which in turn makes it more expensive for banks to borrow money overnight from the central bank and each other. Economic activity will slow down and reduce pressure on price, thus helping to contain inflation. Next, fiscal policy. Fiscal policy uses government spending and tax policy to influence economic conditions such as demand, growth, and inflation. When demand is high, the government can reduce its spending to reduce demand and help reduce upward pressure and price. The government can also raise taxes to reduce disposable income, thereby causing spending to decrease and helping to stabilize price pressures. Fiscal policy is more targeted to help reduce the cost of living for specific groups. This can reduce the level of cost passing on and subsequent price increase to consumers. Lastly, price controls. They are also temporary policy measures to control inflation by targeting specific sectors or goods within a consumption group. Price controls such as price ceiling on essential goods can help ease the burden of high living costs by making goods more affordable for low-income households. Letting prices be determined by supply and demand will result in fair price in line with the value of goods and service. This reflects the price that buyers are willing to pay compared to the price that sellers are willing to charge. In turn, price can serve as signal to encourage efficient allocation of resources. In conclusion, Malaysia managed inflation from 2015 to 2020 years through Bank Negara Malaysia monetary policy by adjusting the overnight policy rates to balance growth and price, as well as government fiscal policy through subsidy such as petrol or diesel, cash assistance, and subsidy rationalization. This involves ongoing dialogue with key stakeholders and clear communication to both public understanding and support for the benefits of these reforms. By aligning monetary and fiscal policy with structural reforms, policymakers can create a cohesive framework that keeps inflation low and stable and ensures that the cost of living remains under control.